Some places welcome you like an old friend, warm, inviting, safe. Others, well, they let you in, but you never quite shake the feeling that you don't belong. I learned that the hard way. This isn't just some campfire ghost story. This happened to me, and to this day, I have no explanation for it. I've tried to rationalize it, convince myself it was just some elaborate prank. But deep down, I know better. What started as a simple move to a quiet neighborhood quickly became something much more disturbing. Something that still haunts me every time I close my eyes. If you think you're safe in your own home, I hope you're right. This happened a few years ago, but it still gives me an unsettling feeling whenever I think about it. The only reason I'm talking about it now is because I feel like it's been long enough since it happened, and I won't risk anything by putting it on the internet. Back then, my wife and I had just moved into the suburbs from the city. We just had our third kid, and between the baby stuff, the toys, and the general chaos, our apartment felt way too cramped. We found a nice house in a quiet, safe neighborhood. The neighbors described it as the kind of place where you'd feel fine leaving the doors unlocked. The house itself wasn't massive, but it was definitely a step up from the tiny space we'd previously been living in. One of the features that caught my wife's eye was the backyard. It had this beautiful, slightly overgrown garden with a few old statues scattered around. They were weathered, a little eerie looking, like something out of Game of Thrones. I know it sounds weird, but my wife and I loved it, said it gave our yard character. I was pretty indifferent, so I left everything as it was, statues and all. I figured it was less work for me, which I was never going to complain about. A few days after we moved in, I was looking out the window, taking in the yard, when I noticed something odd. One of the statues, an angel, I think, was facing away from the house. All the others were facing toward us, so it looked strange. I could have sworn they all faced the same direction, but I didn't really know for sure. I didn't think much of it and just assumed I was misremembering things. The next morning, I looked out the window again, and that's when I noticed it. Another statue had turned around, again facing away from the house. This time, I knew something was up. I had never been more sure about anything in my life. I asked my wife about it, but she just shrugged it off and said she hadn't noticed anything. I thought maybe it was my son, Jimmy. He was a little prankster back then, always up to something. But when I asked him, he just looked at me like I was nuts. I doubted he'd do something like that anyway. I knew something was going on though, but I couldn't prove it. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I tried to ignore it. Besides, I had bigger problems to worry about. I don't like admitting it, but money was really tight during that time, and I lived in perpetual fear that I was going to lose my job. A few days went by without anything strange, and I started to relax. But then one evening, I looked out the window and my heart nearly stopped. All of the statues were lined up in a row at the very edge of the house, just standing there. It was a freakish sight, like something out of a horror movie. I know it sounds ridiculous, but part of me could feel all those eyes looking at me. My breathing went shallow. I couldn't decide whether it was more scary or bizarre. I went outside to get a closer look, trying to make sense of it. Before opening up the back door, I took a few nervous glances around the yard to make sure there was no one out there. It was daylight, but I was paranoid. Eventually, I worked up the courage to open the door and go inspect the statues. I went to lift one of them and immediately realized something. Those statues were heavy, way too heavy for one person to move alone. I couldn't even budge one of them on my own. As I was debating what to do, my wife came outside, and the look on her face told me she was just as freaked out as I was. She suggested maybe some of the other neighbors were messing with us, trying to scare the new people on the block. But that explanation literally made no sense. We had met all the neighbors, and they all seemed like fairly normal people. Plus, I had trouble believing that anyone sane would do this to a family with young children. This was harassment, not some harmless prank. We ended up calling the police, but as you might expect, they couldn't do much. They suggested putting up some security cameras, but we didn't have the money for them. I told the cops we would, but on the inside, I was really reluctant to do something so drastic. They left, and I guess I felt a little better, even though my wife was still extremely shaken up. My wife and I did everything we could to hide the situation from our kids. Say what you will, but we didn't want to scare them. Nothing happened the next day or the next. I speculated that the cops had scared whoever was there away, which did track on many levels, so we tried to forget about it, even though neither of us really felt comfortable. I tried to assure myself that maybe my wife was right. Maybe it had just been a prank or something. That didn't do anything to calm my nerves, though. I was on edge, looking out the windows every time I passed by, half expecting to see the statue somewhere else. I hope no one ever has to experience the sensation of feeling unsafe in your own home. A few days passed without incident. I started thinking the nightmare was over, and for the first time in a while, the house was actually starting to feel like home. I could not have been more wrong. It was a weekend. I don't remember whether it was Saturday or Sunday, but it was definitely a weekend since my kids didn't have school. After some breakfast, I went outside to play in the yard with my kids, and that's when I saw it. Spray painted in big black letters on the back wall of our house were the words, "Go away." I nearly dropped my son when I saw it. Without thinking, I rushed my kids inside and told my wife to stay in the house with them. I don't know what came over me. I'm not that brave of a guy, but I started sprinting through the garden, screaming threats at whoever had vandalized my house. Adrenaline was coursing through my veins, and I was looking for a fight. No one was anywhere in my yard, though. Eventually, I gave up looking. As I was walking back towards the house, the adrenaline in me turned to outright fear. This was serious. Someone had left a direct message meant to scare us. They could have meant us harm, and I knew the situation was only going to escalate from there. The police came again and took down another report, but without any leads, there wasn't much they could do. I insisted that they stay on the property in case those people came back, but they told me they didn't have enough evidence to waste resources like that. As far as they knew, some teenage delinquents could have been behind the graffiti. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They told me they'd make sure a patrol officer was nearby, which I guess was some kind of consolation. My wife was twice as upset as I was, so I reassured her that we'd be okay, even though I was freaking out internally. That night, I was in the kitchen when I heard my wife scream from the living room. I ran in, and she was standing by the window, pointing outside. I looked, and my stomach dropped. There were 5 people standing in our backyard, each of them wearing white face coverings. They were dancing around in this strange, jerky way, almost like puppets. We just stood there, watching them, too shocked to move. It was terrifying. I don't know what they were trying to accomplish, but it was the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen. I snapped out of my haze and grabbed the biggest kitchen knife we had. I basically screamed at my wife to call the police, and while she was doing that, I ran out the back door with a knife in my hand. I screamed like a clinically insane person and took one step toward them before instantly regretting it. There were 5 of them, and 1 of me. They could have been armed. Before anything else could happen, I turned and ran back inside the house like a coward. The knife must have scared them, though, because they stopped dancing and ran into the garden out of sight. I told my wife to run upstairs, find the kids, and hide, and I guarded the back door in case they tried to break in. By the time the police arrived, those people were gone. The police did a thorough search but couldn't find any trace of them. That was the last straw. I didn't care about the costs. I bought and installed security cameras the next day. My wife was hysterical for weeks after that, begging me to let us move somewhere else. I told her that if one more thing happened, that we would, but that we'd probably be screwing ourselves financially if it came to that. Luckily, the cameras must have done the trick, because those people never returned, and we never had another incident occur on the property. The scariest thing, though, is that we still live in the same house and never got an explanation for what happened. I still don't know who they were or what they wanted, and maybe I never will. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that some things just don't have explanations. If you've ever experienced something strange, something that still lingers in the back of your mind, share your story in the comments. And if you enjoyed this, Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more chilling stories. You never know who else might be listening or watching.